Hello and welcome to another episode of our Experts of the Americas series. I'm Valentina Sader, Deputy Director for Impactful Programming at the Adrian Irish Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council, where I lead our work on gender in Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, I am delighted to speak to Jody Ann Corey and Rowena Elliott. Jody Ann is the Chief Executive Officer of AmCham Jamaica, where she leads the promotion of trade and investment between Jamaica and the U.S. while promoting the rule of law. She has a robust career in the human rights and justice space in Jamaica and internationally. Thank you, Jody Ann, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Next, we also have Rowena Elliott. She is the president of the Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Guyana. Keeping strong ties with the private sector at WCCIG, Rowena leads a team of professional and entrepreneurial women whose main goal is to advocate for and create equal and fair business opportunities by fostering an environment that nurtures the growth of women-owned businesses in Guyana. Thank you, Rowena, for joining us.
Thank you for having me as well.
Thank you both. Today's episode will focus on women's economic empowerment. While both Guyana and Jamaica have made strides in improving the economic footing of women in their economies, much room for improvement still exists. For context, a report by the Caribbean Policy Research Institute found that Jamaican women, on average, are only 60% as well off economically as Jamaican men, measured by purchasing power parity. And Guyanese women similarly face significant disadvantages in the labor force, with a participation rate 30% below that of men and much more likely to face vulnerable employment than men. We have been having a series of discussions as part of the Atlantic Council's partnership with UN Women Multi-Country Office Caribbean on the vulnerabilities women and girls face in the Caribbean and the opportunities to bring women and girls to the forefront of countries' economies and society. Uneven economic footing has concrete negative implications for not just the socioeconomic growth model of a country, but ultimately affecting how men and women relate in the community. Without further ado, I wanted to have this conversation with both Jody Ann and Rowena. I wanted to pose a question first to Jody Ann. Jody Ann, what are the main challenges that women and girls face currently to be economically empowered? And what are some of the initiatives that have been successful in addressing some of these challenges?
Valentina, it's great first to focus on the fact that Jamaica has in fact made strides. And it's important for us to see where we were coming from and what it is that we have now. But where we were coming from is a space that everyone was disadvantaged. The enslavement experience in Jamaica and then moving to now full independence is fairly new. And that meant you're looking at a country that overall is disadvantaged, but women in particular, by virtue of childbearing, child rearing, and time outside of the workforce, are at a particular place of vulnerability. What we have seen is that education was one of those real areas where women's disadvantage was shown. And so education opportunities for both boys and girls is something that the government has focused on, but especially for girls, keeping them in school at around grade 9, which is about third form. Those girls and those boys no longer engage in school. And so recognizing that girls in particular are disadvantaged because sometimes we have girls coming out of school because of pregnancy and not resuming education means that there are lifetime knock-on effects that result because they're unable to complete education. We also know that there are some areas of difficulty even with the empowerment strides that have been made. So we have more women in our universities than men, for example, which is creating another dynamic socially that women feel that they're receiving backlash for. There are whole discussions about the displacement of men going on in Jamaican society. And what it feels for some of these women is that they're being punished for making those sorts of educational strides and gains. They are able to take positions in organizations that, by virtue of their degrees, allow them to sit in those seats. But the global figures show that Jamaica and St. Lucia are the countries in the world where you're most likely to have a female middle manager. The problem is women are unable, it seems, to move higher than that due to a very, very robust glass ceiling.
Hey, hi, Valentina. So I think some of the things that
Jodianne mentioned, we can probably see a little bit of it here. One of the things that I've had a discussion recently, speaking about gender and the roles specifically, and how women are perceived and how women are promoted. I think we need to be a bit more intentional. Similarly, here you find that females get higher in school in terms of the university. They're graduating more than males, but yet still, when you reach to that workplace, or you get out there after all of that, you're not able to secure a job, or even if you secure a job, it's probably not worth what you're expecting to put to the value of what you've been studying. And then your pay is definitely not what you expect it to be if you look at your male counterparts. And so we do face some of those issues. And one of the recent conversations I had as well is about that big gap in gender bias with pay scales and salary scales. So for me, one of the things that we're not focusing on is, as mentioned by Jodianne, the point of young girls, and probably show different ways to how you navigate society. We do have that. You start off, unfortunately, with that kind of bias against females and the roles that they play. It is changing a little, very slowly and very minimal as far as I can see from my experience and where I sit. So there has to be a bit more intention behind it and how we craft certain things. Still believe that there's certain jobs, certain industries that they don't fit into, or that they're not welcome into. So unlike places, I guess, out of the Caribbean, I've had a contact in Canada. She's about 23 when I met her, and she works in their forest industry, and she operates one of these machines, cutting logs, cutting down trees and logging. That's the kind of thing that we don't see here. Even for as simple as a forklift operator here in Guyana, which is is gonna be needed so much now because of the industries that the oil and gas industry and what we need, the kind of labor that we need here. So I'm for me, it's not as encouraged. We do have a lot of work to do to encourage certain aspects, and I do believe it needs to start in more than likely the high schools, so that we kind of craft the mindset of not just the females, the young girls coming up, but also their male colleagues coming up in school, so that when they become the workforce, you don't have that kind of mindset of who's superior because of male or female, and you don't have that kind of mindset that where females should be at home and be the main caretaker. Let's have that mindset where it is all shared responsibilities as it relates to home life. And you can have a male nurse. You can have, as in, we shouldn't even have to say male nurse, but you can also have a female in the logging industry, in the forestry industry, in agriculture, that can take up these roles. So similarly, I think we share in our economies. I don't know. I think Jamaica is a bit leading in as it relates to, especially I think, corporate governance and how they see and view and place females in corporate structures. I don't think I'm seeing a lot of that here. So we need to also place some focus on that here.
I think that one of the things that both you and Jodianne were mentioning is the importance and the role of education, and the role that education plays in actually bringing both boys and girls into a mindset of understanding that the preconceived notions of what men and women or girls and boys should do are no longer needed. It's not the case anymore. You don't need to necessarily have to have these biases, and encouraging the education and the access to education to both in the same footing allows them both to have equal opportunities when they get to the workforce, for example, and that is a benefit to the whole of society. I believe Jodianne is back, so I will. The next question, Jodianne, if you want to finalize this too, and I think you might be going in this direction, is also in terms of the opportunities that we were mentioning and the initiatives that are taking place. In what ways can the private sector be a driving force of increased opportunities for women in the labor force? And how can governments, or how have governments been supportive of these initiatives led by the private sector or initiated by the private sector? You're on mute.
Thank you so much. I think it's so important for the private sector to, in fact, be a key driver and a key stakeholder in this. In Jamaica, the government is the largest employer. And so government initiatives and government changes make a huge difference. But it's the private sector that's often the ones that asks for and calls for those changes that you're seeing. They are the ones that say, we can't afford to have half our labor force not in fact actively involved. They're the ones that say, we are unable to and unwilling to live in a world where, given some of the disparities that exist, some of the misogyny that exists, some of the issues that exist, not have active participation of women. And so what they will do is, for example, put in place better maternity leave policies than the government, for example, to encourage active participation of women, recognizing that where a woman has to come out of the workforce in order to have a child, that the disadvantage that she might receive by virtue of that is not something that they think needs to be continued if they want to continue to keep the best and the brightest. If, as I've said before, more women are going to university, that means your top performers tend to be women. It means that those who are excelling in their fields tend to be women. And so private sector companies are, in fact, getting involved and being part of the conversation, actively saying, how can we support women in the workplace? There are also very, very different situations in Jamaica versus other countries where women and men are paid different salaries. In Jamaica, we don't have that problem. Women's economic disadvantage often comes by virtue of them having to go in and out of the labor force due to care responsibilities and the like. But it is not a pure economic factor with regard to salary paid to each of these individuals. And the private sector is quite good about maintaining that clear line of saying there is no reason for them not to be paid the same. They do the same.
Rowena, that's a very interesting point on the Jamaican side. What is it like in Guyana? I mean, you work with women entrepreneurs, so what is that context like for them too?
I think as it relates to the for one, the pay scale, it just brought me back to a friend of mine who was Jamaican. She moved back to Jamaica recently, but she came to take a job in Guyana, and she was being paid significantly less than the person who held the position here in Guyana. And it was a male. So that when you mentioned that, that entire thing came to my head. And what we found, or well, I guess what we did kind of like sat and tried to figure out like why is it even happening? It's also, it shouldn't happen to begin with, but then we also find that females tend to not, we're not open, or we're not as strong as we think. Maybe we might be strong, but we just don't do it. It's negotiation and understanding what our value is. Because as you rightfully said, more women are excelling. And we mentioned similarly here, the university, and I think that's very much global. You find a whole bunch of reports telling us that. So they're coming out of their fields on top. They're proving that the things that they can do, similarly to men, and even maybe sometimes better. But it's the case where we still kind of underestimate our own value. And I've just seen that from the entrepreneurial scale, from the entrepreneurial end with the females that I've been exposed to, where sometimes you kind of figure, you talk about what's your journey, and the journey is like, oh, I was scared to take this risk, but this was 3 years ago, and I'm so happy that I did, but I should have done it sooner. So we always tend to second guess ourselves. And I've spoken to persons, and there was a show here, in a small TV show, where the person interviewed female entrepreneurs who would have excelled and overcame their diversities. And back-to-back episodes, 3 women said the same thing: I wish I'd done it sooner. So we know that we second guess ourselves. We also know that we tend to hesitate as it relates to negotiating. So while the society has to change as well, I think there are things about ourselves as female entrepreneurs, female incorporates, that we need to understand what we bring to the table and speak to that. Whereas a male or male counterparts will in no time sit to say, this is what I want. I mean, these are the salary, this is a scale, these are the benefits I'm looking at because of XYZ. We will tend to, and I think I'm even guilty of doing that. So that's how I also know that I've been in that situation, and I really kind of like froze, So again, it's really about building skills, and the private sector will play a huge role in that, I think, because it then you kind of build that environment into what is expected, and what should be a norm, and if it's a case where it's normal, then it shouldn't even be a topic, whereas Judy, and you mentioned in Jamaica, it's not really a challenge that you guys have because it's the norm, you expect this, but it's just the encouragement, I think, and building out what we would like our new norm to be. And also understanding that when you doubt the capacity, well, the capability, I shouldn't say capacity, when you doubt the capability of the female entrepreneurs in whether small, medium-sized businesses, and even your female leads, heads of departments, I don't think we have many female CEOs in Guyana, which was also mentioned by Judy Ann, where you kind of were stuck at middle management, So when you build out what that should be and what that norm should be, then we can understand that this environment is what we're striving towards. Sometimes I do believe, though, that at least now, it has to be intentional, at least to begin with. So as the private sector, we need to build that into our company policies, build that into our hiring process, that we need this amount of women, whether it's employees or also as it relates to management and top management. So it has to be intentional to start with, and then that becomes maybe a norm. One of the things I recently spoke to, as it relates to women in the workforce, is we've had over COVID, and I'm pretty sure many other countries, where a lot of women fell off out of the workforce because of COVID, having to stay at home, having to, take care of the kids because of the homeschooling. But what we found is that as a result of that, we did find a couple of female entrepreneurs budding out of that, because then persons were able to say, okay, I have to add income somehow, so I need to find something to do. So they've been finding ways, whether it's a small online store or some product or some hobby that they were turning into a product or a skill that they were building over the period of the pandemic. So whether or not they're able to get back into the workforce, or they're able to now build out that business that they've started, it's somehow we're still adding, because when you have a female owner, female-led business, you will find that that person will intentionally, or not even intentionally, I should say, just by nature, they will look to hire more females. We have a firm, which is also a part of our chamber. She started by designing invitations. That was her craft. And she is fully blown into specialty invitations, publishing of magazines, branding. And so it's an entire firm, and her entire firm, company, her workers, they're all females. And so that's just something she did on her own. I'm not saying that's something that everybody has to do, but sometimes we need to be very conscious of it, to open the environment up to see, we're going to do this. How do we bring the women that are out of the labor force back into the labor force, especially with Guyana needing thousands of persons to fill roles because of the oil and gas industry. So, and it's obviously going to be those roles that are a bit technical, that women are not, I'll say, traditionally used to, and that we've always pegged as a male job. But we ought to start training the females, giving them that opportunity to get into these roles. And I think that's where the private sector will come in. That's where government policies will also, can also lean to.
It's wonderful to hear some of the resilient stories of women, and how they've been able to, this is of people, but it's wonderful to hear how women also are having that role and playing that role and being able to be resilient in that way. One thing that you mentioned, though, is about the norms, right? Like recreating the norms. And both of you have impressive careers in your respective fields and are today in leadership roles. Why is there a need for women's leadership, and why is it necessary to transform the performance of women in the economy? I think we were already talking a little bit about this issue in particular, and you, Rowena, mentioned your own experience and how you perhaps questioned or took a little bit too long to negotiate and push for the position that you actually deserved. But this is, I think, a clear example of why it's so important to have women in leadership positions, so you can bring other women along with you. But Jody and Rowena, any other thoughts in that regard?
I think it's so important. So this is me now supporting and jumping off of what Rowena said, because we often meet women who are unable to or unwilling to see the value and the benefit that they bring. And much of that has to do with the very cultural context in which we live. In Caribbean culture, you are venerated to be mother, you're venerated to be selfless, and you're venerated to put others above yourself. And that is the core of the base of Caribbean femininity and womanhood. It is so then difficult for someone who decides that they want to break out of that to in fact make the kind of switch and jump into what is understood to be more male-led and more male-dominated, but also having more male features and characteristics, being more concerned about yourself, not prioritizing everyone else above yourself, making hard decisions and having hard conversations. Those are often things that within Caribbean contexts are not only not looked upon well for women, but are actively discouraged in women. And so having that sort of conversation is really, really important for you to be able to see economic empowerment be something that we can see, but also it's also something not only cultural, but it's also maybe a global phenomenon. Harvard Business Review said that women, when they see job descriptions, feel that they must meet 100% before they apply for a job, while men often look to about 70%. With that then is a very different assessment of skills, a different idea of competence. If competence for a girl in Caribbean society is defined by being able to cook and clean and wash, you're expected to be excellent at those at a very young age. And so your idea of being good enough is excellence in other spaces. And so for Caribbean women, they often don't feel that they have the ability to jump off and then learn as they go, because they are often conditioned with the idea that they need to be excellent from the jump. So women leadership allows me to say to my team, because I know that Harvard Business Review studied, because I know that they are excellent and I work with them in these spaces, to continue to not only see the rooms where I see my colleagues in and realize that the women that I work with are no less capable, no less competent, but then to use my eyes and help them see that they too can walk into these spaces. I think it's therefore important for women-led businesses to continue to make space for other women, and that they do that. So like Rowena in Guyana, here in Jamaica, about 80% of our economy is made up of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and women lead the majority of those. And where they make space for empowerment for themselves, they are often likely to hire on other women as well. So women-led businesses are then critical. They don't need to be formal CEO jacket and tie, but they have made some sort of strides, and they understand childcare and care need accommodations that are not just children, but caring for elderly parents and caring for other family members, that they're willing to make accommodations for those, flexible work schedules are things that they're willing to think through and accommodate in ways that we just often don't see big corporations and big businesses make that sort of initiative change without women leaders who are able to think through, do you need nursing rooms? Do you need time to pump during the day? Are there times where you might not be available because of certain obligations that might arise? These are some of the things that then allow us to have a broader thinking around the work that is being done, still asking for the same sort of efficiency, but recognizing that with different strengths, you have different ways of accomplishing things. And I think women leaders bring that conversation to the room. Now, not all women leaders do that, but by virtue of having more of us in the room, there are more opportunities for these conversations to take place.
Sure you want to jump in and add to this, but one thing that I would say is also, obviously, women's leadership is so important for all of the reasons that Jody Ann explained, but also, as Rowena was mentioning earlier, having the norm be different is also important, because you also need men to be advocates of women's rights, women's leadership, and to make sure that men and boys are part of this change. So Rowena, over to you if you have any other thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think as it relates to the, having more women leadership and women-owned, women-led businesses, it's really to, as Julianne mentioned, bring that voice to the table. And the only way for you to understand or have, I guess, a perspective of gender lens on anything is if you have somebody there as a constant little reminder. I mean, a lot of times you find your male counterparts, they really support you, but it's not a case where they are intentionally blocking certain things. But as mentioned, name and nature, certain things that they're accustomed to over the years, what was passed down from one male to the next, or one father to his son, certain things are just innate. And so it's not a case where it's always blocked out intentionally. But if you have somebody there to just give you a reminder and give you a nudge and bring that voice to the table within discussions and decision-making rooms. So it's not about just bringing me to the table. It's about understanding that the decisions that we're making will take what I'm saying into account. And the reason I'm here is so that I also represent as a body of especially from the chamber, different chamber, and you represent a body of people. So you also understand what's going on. So from being in that space, you get what their challenges are, and you're able to then take that and bring it to that proverbial table and have that discussion and see these are the things that are challenging. This is what we believe that can be done, because you are not leading a company of men. You're leading a company of different genders. You're leading diversity in terms of backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. So that's why, for me, female leadership is needed for that. And in also as it relates to building communities and building out the kind of trickle effects that you get from a woman that is in leadership position. Like we mentioned, it really is not about just hiring females or anything, but it's literally about building out what's around you, because we're innately I guess wired to be nurturers and caring. And so we want to see the people and things around us as well, and not just ourselves grow. And I think that's where it comes back to, when you move, you kind of like put your hand back and bring somebody along. One of the ministries here, Ministry of Human and Social Services, they have a program called the Women, I think, Investment Initiative. It's WIN. The different I's, it's WIIN, and it gets me every time. So forgive me on that. But one of the things that the minister will always say is that, they've passed thousands of women through this program, and it's a capacity building program in various aspects, various industries, from childcare to photography, to if persons want to get into manufacturing. There are different entities and different ways in which they train. But one of the things she always says, like, when you're finished, you've passed through the program, you're now doing what you're doing, feel free to share that information along. Encourage somebody to register. Similarly, one of the things that we do is capacity building. We have a program, or rather a project, funded by IDB and WeFi. And it's a capacity building program, and we're rolling it out in about 6 or 7 of our regions here. And it's one of the things that we've realized in one of our semi-rural areas, region, is when we had our graduation ceremony there. At that ceremony, one of the ladies, she was like, she said, "Miss." So she's like, "Miss, I have 10 people waiting for the next one." So we weren't planning to go to that region again, at least not right away. But because of that, we literally said, okay, we're going to roll out another cohort from this region. And so those are the things that you see in women, and it just jumps to them. And because of that, I think is some of the main reasons as to why we really need that push for women leadership, female entrepreneurship pushing. And like we said, it's not the big corporates that they're building out. They're starting small. Eventually, they're going to expand into entities that can trade regionally. One of the programs that we have under that project is an Accelerate, where we're taking about 20 women who have been in business for maybe about 3 to 5 years. There is a couple of criteria that they need to meet. But those women are going to go through a program, and it's no longer to keep them trading locally. It's to keep them and making their product or service to put them on that international market. So we're looking to upskill and upgrade you in such a way that you are now ready to take your product or service into a space that is not just Guyana. And we put them into this network of women and suppliers. So it's about getting them into the supply chain of these huge corporations. And which is what will come back to how we normalize certain things or reprogram the norms. How many companies are aware of the amount of female-owned businesses that's in their procurement line? So that's something that I think once we start to talk about at the right forums, given the right ears, then it'll eventually reach.
I hope that this Experts of the Americas actually reaches a lot of people that can hear about some of these very interesting and effective initiatives that are already in place in Guyana. Jodianne, love the hand raising. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. No, it was really important to me, given something that you had shared about having men in the room as well, support and be advocates for the changes that we want to see. We do have some male champions who are willing to speak out, who are willing to elevate the voices of their women colleagues when they're in rooms, having these conversations and making sure that they're not being spoken over. But we also have to be very aware of what norm changing does. Norm changing means that everybody doesn't come on board at the same time. And it does mean that you are likely to have backlash. And so part of what is happening now in Jamaican society is that as women are being elevated, as we're seeing then more educational opportunities being accessed by women, better jobs being accessed by women, we've seen a dispossession of men, which it has been then a point of backlash, with it being said that women are now not only taking over, but then we're no longer able to see the sort of equitable society that had been discussed earlier. So what you are seeing then is where women come into the workplace, especially if you're the first woman holding a role, if you're that first female voice in that room, you have incredible pressures placed upon you, because you are not only within that room and that space, but you're also understood to be the secretary, the note taker, the person who gets coffee. And you must learn then, when you work in that space, to take up space, which is a whole other skill set for women who actually do elevate to that position, to then sit in the knowledge that they in fact do belong in those rooms. And that's very hard for them. And sometimes we see women replicating the habits of the men before them, because they need to be incredibly strong, because they need to be incredibly brave. We sometimes see where they are fighting for their own lives, so they're not in a position to advocate, do the pulling of other women into rooms with them in a more direct way. Their very presence, though, is that incentive. It is that bright beaming light for women coming into these spaces. And so that is something to be considered as well. Sexual harassment is also something that is incredibly important to talk about as women move into these spaces. That has been such a significant problem here in Jamaica that we recently passed our sexual harassment law, and it specifically concerns sexual harassment in the workplace. When you have more women in the workplace and in spaces of work, the power dynamics are often such that some men believe that they have been given a free girlfriend, that they've been given somebody that they can date, or they can attempt to pressure into sexual conversation and to sexual behavior. And part of what that means then for women is that they're moving into hostile spaces. They're moving into spaces where they really do have to keep their guard up, where they have to be very, very aware of what it is that is going on around them. And we sometimes don't punish, or at least sanction, the men who are in fact violators, who often tend to be repeat violators, making that workspace even more difficult for women as they walk into these spaces, trying to take up room in these spaces. So the backlash is also something that I think needs to be discussed, because while we do have men who are great champions and great advocates, they are unable to change the hearts and minds of men who believe that you are better served by being supported by a man. And there's a whole cultural context around that, about being, in Jamaica, it's called being minded. It's being taken care of by a man, that it is better that he makes money and you take care of him as a way to get your own resources, which is what accounts for Capri's studies saying that 60% of women are less well off than their male counterparts, because of that mindset, and then because of some of the impediments in the work world that facilitate and support.
I think that that's such an important point that you bring up, because we had a whole conversation about gender-based violence, and obviously the role that the private sector also can play in addressing some of these issues, right? Like obviously you have domestic violence, but also in the case that you're mentioning, sexual harassment, sexual assault in the workforce, in the workplace, or wherever, honestly, is something that needs to be addressed. And this is part of the conversation why we're also talking about women's economic empowerment and then also political participation, because this positioning, you help push and foster this environment in which women have are drivers of their own lives, and in a way you free yourself from this conditionality of being dependent on someone, and therefore having to be submissive to whatever that might be. So 100% thank you for bringing that up. To wrap up though, because we are going on and on, I wanted to wrap up by asking a very tough and specific question. If you had to choose based on the context that you were in Jamaica and in Guyana, thinking about the Caribbean region, what is in the conversation that we just had, what is one policy recommendation that you believe would allow for greater and more effective participation of women in the labor force and create the opportunities for the next generation of women and girls to be better prepared for it? We talked about education as being essential to this, but what is one policy recommendation that you feel like is missing, or that could be pushed or improved to allow for this to happen? And I'll start with you, Rowena.
All right, that's definitely a big question, and I think I will probably go with where I say we need to be very intentional in what we do. So I guess for policy or something like what we can get a policy is to have as much, well, not as much, but maybe there must be some sort of way to outline where organizations, and this can go for even state boards, because I've learned that a lot of times you get state boards, they call on the private sector to send a representative. So for me, if you say you must have a private sector representative, you must have a public sector person, you must have somebody in this field or whatever, based on the state board, then you can say that, make some sort of representation or mandate that we must have a female representative. Whether it fits from a private sector end or it fits into one of the other criterias, but that can be something that we can start with. Because if you're going to go, for example, on the political end, we have many state boards here. I don't know if there's any policy that's crafted to say that you must have female representatives. So some state boards and some government agencies, semi-autonomous agencies, their entire heads of departments are male. And there was one entity announcing that these are our head of department, and there was about 12 men. And so for me, I think it'll be something to that extent, where it's not necessarily only state, but if it can be incorporated into some ways where, for example, Guyana, we recently, crafted and redrafted and added and tweaked our local content law. And it can start there as well, where we've said that, companies existing and companies wanting to come into the Guyana space, into the oil and gas industry specifically, that you have to have this amount of Guyanese in your workforce, this amount of management being Guyanese. But then we can also say this amount of your management can be female. So for me, and that is the local content policy, which is a document that we've been often told by our parliamentarians that it can be changed. We recently revamped the classes of or the industries in which more Guyanese companies will fill. So then if we're saying that, we can say your hiring structure can also have some sort of provision for specifically female leads. So I think that's where I will tweak that, I'll push that, where something like that can be done. It might be difficult, but yeah, to make that intentional. Yeah.
For me, it's the enabling environment. So a policy position that says we cannot ask for women to continue to come into the labor force and be sacrificial lambs. We cannot understand the way that we are hoping to drive an economy that has full participation of as many people as possible without looking at some of the enabling environment barriers that exist. So sexual harassment was one of those big ones, where if you're going to be having more participation in the labor force, sexual harassment policies being put in place make a difference, but also enforcement. I spoke about the Sexual Harassment Act that has been recently passed. So that's already on the government agenda, but the enforcement is a gap issue that we have highlighted, saying that we are unclear as to how this gets enforced if the company can continue to keep it under wraps, and if that person, who often tends to be a serial harasser, continues to stay on board and continues to be an issue within the organization. Enabling environment issues as well around what happens if women move into middle management positions. Kind of like what Rowena said, what provisions do you have to support and strengthen the network of support that these women need in order to move to higher levels of authority? We often see that it's never a matter of their competence, skills, and abilities, but often a matter of who they know and the networks in which they're able to participate in, which means that you have those individuals who are not enabled to then perform at their highest level because of some other structural barriers. So I think if there's any policy initiative I would work on, it is one, making sure that if you do have legislation in place, they actually work, and that they actually do the things that you say that they're supposed to be doing. And two, when you do see women in spaces, when you do have women who are able to break through and make their way there, then you also have a responsibility incumbent on you to then put things in place that enable not only their participation, but also future participation. Because what often happens is that women who go through hell in those spaces say to other women, don't do it. It wasn't worth it. It cost me my life. And so really, after being that bright beacon in those amazing spaces, they're often the ones who, to save other women, say, I got no support. It was hellish. Don't do it again. And so I think that enabling environments so that they can allow for everybody to thrive, but not to disadvantage women, in order to allow for a more equitable world, is something that I think that I would suggest to any government.
This was such a rich conversation and an enriching conversation, honestly. I think that we went from talking about some of the initiatives that are already in place that are very successful to some of the opportunities to work on and to improve, which I think also helps us understand the context of both Guyana and Jamaica in terms of gender equity and how we can be part of this change and the driver of these changes. So with that, I would like to thank you, Rowena. Thank you, Jodianne, for participating, for sharing your insights. I hope to see you in Jamaica and Guyana very soon. And for our audience, thank you so much for tuning in. And I look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.